I received a number of reports from students who got their LSAT scores back earlier today and were surprised that they dropped 10, 20 points or more from their practice tests, even though they felt like the exam went fine. Potentially complicating things is the fact that LSAC confirmed that they removed a flawed question from scoring for many test takers in the logical reasoning section, particularly the question on hair pigmentation. Today, I'll walk you through my thoughts on what happened and what this means for you if you took the October LSAT. But first, for those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I personally increased my own LSAT score from a 152 to a 175. Now, when you look at LSAT message boards and forums, there is a selection bias in those who post. For those who felt like the exam went fine and then got perfectly fine scores, they're typically not reporting, and if they are reporting this, it's not getting a lot of attention or upvotes because it's not that noteworthy when things go as expected. However, when things don't go as expected, if there is a significant drop or significant increase in scores, that may get a bit more attention. And as we know from social media, negative reports tend to get outsized attention. Now, of course, unique to this October LSAT is the fact that LSAC confirmed and admitted there was a flawed question on the exam, and they removed it from scoring for everyone who received that question on hair pigmentation. But it isn't necessarily obvious to me that this would lead to a widespread drop in scores across the board. Of course, if you got that question right, it would help you by one raw score point. If you had gotten that question wrong, it would relatively hurt you by one raw score point. Now, LSAC isn't just taking off one raw score point for all test takers. They had to recalibrate the entire so-called curve, aka raw score conversion, for everyone who had that test form, but that would not lead to a 10, 20 point drop. It might lead some students to lose a point on the test, might lead others to gain a point, and it might lead others to have no impact at all, just because it's not as if every raw score is 1 point on the scaled score, meaning that if the LSAT has roughly, say, 76 scored questions across the 3 sections, but the LSAT is on a 120 to 180 scale, that means that not every increase or decrease in raw score leads to a change in a point or two on the test. Now, aside from this issue of a question removed from scoring, which happens incredibly rarely, it's only happened a handful of times over the course of 30 plus years on the LSAT. Aside from that fact, there are also some conspiracy theories going around that LSAC is making the LSAT harder to balance it out with those who took the previous format with logic games, which was maybe somehow easier because logic games is easier to perfect. That, of course, is absurd because logic games was easier for some students, harder for other students. It isn't necessarily uniformly easier or harder for all test takers. There's also been a lot of recent score inflation over the past few years, in part due to that temporary LSAT flex format, but more so because there's been a significant increase in LSAC granting accommodations for extra time and extra breaks, which has led to a significant increase in LSAT score medians and percentile changes. For example, all of the top 14 law schools now have LSAT score medians of 170 or above, with Yale at the top end of an LSAT score median of 175. It used to be that scoring a 173 on the LSAT in the 99th percentile, but you now need to get a 175 in order to be in the 99th percentile. So it's possible that LSAC could be making the so-called curve harder to account for this. And if that is in fact the case, it doesn't seem quite fair to me to make such a radical change over such a short period of time. They should instead do it more gradually, if at all. But bottom line, of course, it is what it is. And you'll have to focus on drilling hard questions to be ready for anything whenever you're taking the LSAT. And if you are retaking the LSAT going forward, at LSAT Unplugged, we'll create a personalized day-by-day study plan for you, mapping out exactly what to do every single day from now through your test date, whenever you're taking the LSAT, whether it's in January, February, April, or beyond. Because if you want to get a different result next time on an LSAT retake, you're going to have to prep differently if there's a resource you were considering but didn't pursue. now is the time. The best way to prep, of course, especially if you're on a short timeline for November, January, or February, it's going to be one-on-one LSAT coaching, personalized to exactly what you need on your schedule. You can check out the links below to find out more and to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. Now, by the way, regarding that withdrawn LSAT question on hair pigmentation, it seems odd to me that LSAC wouldn't make some uniform announcement, but rather you have to learn about it on a message board. That seems odd to me. It also seems somewhat suspect to me that they're certainly going to have to change their reporting of this sort of event in the future and perhaps change how they handle challenges to potentially flawed LSAT questions, perhaps give some more transparency on this point. And if you are worried that you could be affected by this sort of thing going forward, you may want to consider as part of your LSAT pacing strategy that you don't spend an inordinate amount of time on any single LSAT question, because every question is worth the same. And if LSAC does in fact remove a question from scoring, you're not getting that raw score point anyway. It's going to be a wash. And so you want to think to yourself, is it worth me overly focusing disproportionate amount of time on this particular question, whether it's flawed or not, whether it ends up being removed or not, at the expense of other questions in the section, since again, everything is worth the same, that it might be a prudent risk mitigation strategy for you to spend your time a bit more evenly spread across the different difficult questions in that section once you've locked down the easier questions. And by the way, one last resort, if you think something was off about your LSAT score, if it was wildly lower than you think it should have been, LSAC does provide a score audit option for $150 to double check your scores. If the new score is different, if it's higher or lower, that new score will stand and you can't audit your scores a second time. This could be a bit of a money grab on LSAC's part. Now that the LSAT is administered online, this is more of an artifact from back when the LSAT was on paper, and there was a risk that perhaps you could have misbubbled or there was an error with the Scantron reading. You're highly unlikely to get a change, especially since this is now, of course, a computerized test online, but it might be worth it for you just for the peace of mind, especially if your score came back 10, 20 points lower than you think it should have been. Anyway, folks, that's all for now. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.